everyone, and welcome to a little new episode of our Voxel Smash space, where we talk with people from the gaming industry and everything related to games, journalists, everyone, experts of everything. And today, speaking of experts, we have Felipe Pepe, who is the editor and writer of the computer RPG book, and is just a lover of obscure RPGs and also obscure games in general, I would say.
My background is a bit unique, especially like in the people who like usually talk about video games.
Mm-hmm.
But even like in Brazil is a bit weird because Brazil is mostly like a console country. At least it was like in the 90s and the 2000s.
Yep.
We had like a huge scene of like, especially the Nintendo, the bootleg copies. We have the Phantom system and a bunch of like bootleg copies of the NES. Then we moved to like the pirate PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2.
Mm-hmm.
So like it was very much like the console country. No one had computers, but my father worked with computers. Okay. So I always had them in my house. Even like in the 80s, it was forbidden to have computers like imported from outside until 1992 because of the military dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
But my father smuggled in a computer, an Amiga 500 anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first time I had contact with a computer was the Amiga 500. And then he started, like working with the MS-DOS computers, the Windows 95, 98. So I went through all those evolutions while everyone else that I knew, like even the grown-ups and everything, everyone just had consoles. Like it was extremely rare to have a computer at home. So it was like a very different experience, like we would play games like Betrayal of Krondor. Like I had no idea what was going on because everything was in English. I couldn't understand. No one that I knew was playing this kind of game. Like they would come to my house to see, oh, this is a computer and they can play games, like very old experience of like getting to know this technology.
Mm-hmm.
But then as the year passed by, there was friends that I knew that had the Super Nintendo. I started playing games like I would borrow to play Chrono Trigger and Breath of Fire and stuff like this. My English would improve.
Mm-hmm.
And then one day I came across, I always tell this because I think like it was really like, let's say, an important moment in my life because I was at the time, let's say, like 11 years old, more or less 11, 12. I used to play a lot of tabletop RPGs, especially like GURPS and a system that we have in Brazil called 3D&T. It's kind of anime inspired. It's called Defenders of Tokyo.
Mm.
And I love playing that and I love playing games, but I couldn't find, let's say, the overlap. Chrono Trigger is cool, but it's a completely different experience in my mind. And then I saw this game magazine that was talking about Fallout 1. And they had this article, this little screenshot of the game saying, like, in this game, if you make a very smart character, you can talk to the farmer in Shady Sands and teach him about crop rotation so he can improve his farming and you get extra XP. And I was like, this sounds so cool. Like, like actually like how you create your character and the things that you choose affect the game. And so I went there and like managed to find a pirate copy of Fallout 1. And, that kind of thing, like you go to your cousin's house and you go like download the game and stuff like this. And I started playing and I loved the game. And I couldn't understand and I was like progressing. And like I used to play GURPS already, so the system was very familiar. But I also had my brother with me, who is like 4 years younger. So he was about, like, say, 8 years old, didn't understand much English. And he played Fallout just killing everyone in the game. Like he couldn't understand any dialogue. So, I got to the first city. I'm here in Klamath. I'm going to kill everyone. And for him, it was super fun. Yeah. And what is really cool is that the game allows this and the game reacts to this. You can play Fallout 1 doing all the stories and the quests. He was just killing everyone and he was having like a really cool experience. He would see things that I did not see. So for me, that was the moment that I was like, okay, I really love RPGs. I want more of this. And then it was like, okay, Fallout 2, Baldur's Gate, Morrowind, Arcanum, and it just kept going and kept going. Then like how the book came along is like around, I think, 2005. In 2004, I moved to São Paulo. I used to live in the countryside in Brazil where we didn't have internet at home. I had to go like to the city to use it, like on LAN house, cyber cafes, play Counter-Strike with everyone.
Yeah.
And then we moved to Sao Paulo, and then I finally had internet at home. And I started to go to online forums. There were some in Portuguese, but the biggest one was the RPG Codex and the RPG Watch. So I joined them, and we kept talking about RPGs and learning about these other games and everything. I felt that I had a lot of catch up to do because none of the classics, like Wizardry, Ultima, Might and Magic, none of those were like ever released in Brazil.
Yeah.
So I had to catch up on of those. And then one day we simply decided to make like a list, like, oh, let's list the top 50 RPGs of all time and ask people to write like a little paragraph explaining why this game is cool. We did this. It was super cool to do it, like a really interesting process. A lot of cool discussions. We still have that list on the website. It grew from 50 to 72 because, we had to put some of extra games that were too cool to leave out. And from that, the idea came like, okay, this is like one of the coolest things we ever did in the Codex. And it's so interesting and everyone is sharing, everyone is enjoying. Why don't we make a book out of this? And that's where the idea started. And my plan was like, oh, I have all the text, I have all the games. In 3 months, I can make this book. And it took me 5 years to finish the first edition of the book because we were like, okay, we have all these games, but let's say we have Ultima 7, but we should put like Ultima 1 to like 9 as well because they're important games. We should put Wizardry 1 to 8. We should put Might and Magic 1 to 8 and like 1 to 10 now. And you just kept adding and adding, and the list just kept growing and growing, and you need more people to review the more obscure games. Like, like I want a review of Fallout 1. Okay, anyone can write a review of Fallout 1. Like, everyone wants to write it. But then you say, okay, I need a review of like a super obscure game, like, I don't know, Alter Ego, which is like a personality RPG from the 80s. Yeah. There's like 5 people who play this game, I guess, and could write a review about it.
I'm one of them.
Yeah. So I had to like, search the internet to find these people. And that was basically the process. So I spent like 5 years collecting interesting games to put into the book and contacting people that could write about them.
Okay, so it grew from like a personal project to something that became way more and more like structured, let's say. So it became something of more of a job, if you can if you can use that word. So something from like
I spent so much time working on this. I don't even want to calculate. It's like
but yeah, it's interesting one thing that you said that of course Brazil, as you said, is a console country. At least it was a console country back in the 90s and the 2000s. And as a parallel to what I experienced myself, for example, you might know that Italy is definitely was definitely big on home computers around the same time. Of course, we also had consoles, but I would say most people, at least those who developed games, who grew up then to develop games, all grew up on Commodore computers for the most part. But the fun bit, I call it fun bit, but yeah, the interesting bit, the trivia bit, let's say, is that we had so much piracy, which again, it's a great parallel to Brazil. We had so much piracy that most people who grew up with the Commodore 64, most of them don't even played any RPGs because pirates weren't really interested in pirating RPGs because they were complicated, big games, and pirates would often work with those kind of legitimate companies in Italy, and they were just interested in quantity over quality. So no one was releasing like the Bard's Tale, for example. They would not be interested in that. They would just release smaller games, maybe Last Ninja. They would cut up Last Ninja in like 5 or 6 different games and pretend, oh, this is Ninja 5, this is Ninja 6. So interestingly, most people grew up with computers, but very few, at least those who played before the Amiga, actually played RPGs. For example, I grew up with the Commodore 64, and I think my first RPG that I played was on the Mega Drive. So interestingly enough, I got into RPGs later. So that shaped a bit the way that I looked at RPGs, even though growing up with an home computer first. So it is interesting because piracy in Italy gave different kind of vibes of the, you missed altogether on RPGs, on graphic adventures as well. You missed on all these complicated games for the most part, and those came later. So in a way, Italy is similar to Brazil in the end, even though we had a lot of people that grew up with own computers. But yeah, and it's no surprise, of course, that we do have very few RPGs developed in Italy, I think. And I think the first true RPGs, at least in the 90s, I mean, there might be some smaller things in the 80s, like done on the Commodore 64, very simple stuff, I would say. Which were back then when RPGs were called adventures. So, you got adventures. So, yeah. There's a couple of those, but yeah, very basic things. Like the first two RPGs actually came on the Amiga, and that was, I think, already like 91, I think. 92.
It's the one Il Corno del Tempo, ne?
Yep, that's the one. Time Horn is the...
Yeah.
At least from what I know, unless there's some very ultra obscure stuff that I never heard about, I would say Time Horn is the first true RPG that was developed in Italy. And it's still pretty simple. I don't know if you played it, but yeah, it's not really incredibly complicated. It was developed by 3 very young people, and so yeah, so I can definitely say we don't really have a huge RPG scene for the reason I mentioned. But yeah, I will stop talking about it because no one cares.
No, but just cutting on what you said is very interesting, because I agree that like the translation is a huge part. Like in Brazil, like not only you have like those games are really hard to play if you don't know English, and but it's very interesting that like the countries where they took off, let's say, that had like a similar position, which is like, I think especially like in Russia, in Poland, and in Taiwan, where they actually had like a lot of piracy, but they actually got RPGs going. They had local developers doing the translations. So it's super interesting when you look, like they were, let's say, if you check Taiwan, like in the early 90s, late 80s, they were like, okay, here's Ultima 7 with the fully translated manual into Chinese. And it's like completely pirate, but they translated the entire manual. And it's the same thing with like CD Projekt Red, like doing the translations into Polish for like the early Baldur's Gate and stuff like this, For me, it's really interesting that like they managed to do this, which is something like, I know some people like in Brazil who did like a very detailed history about the game development in Brazil, the PC side. And one thing that we discussed a lot about is how like actually going legit in Brazil is part of the reason why the PC industry in Brazil never developed the game developer. Because we're Latin America, like we're like super under the influence of the United States. And when we started getting PC games, they immediately, let's say in the early 90s, mid 90s, they went legit. They were like, okay, these are official titles that were like fully translated with approval. So like we had the Monkey Island, especially the LucasArts games, all released in Portuguese with like official translations, which on one side is nice because you get the official product with the official box, the translation and everything.
Yep.
On the other hand, those people, they spend so much money paying licensing fees and everything. And like, let's say being this company, they're just like the localizers, that when we reach the 2000s, and you start to get like not only CD-ROM game magazines and online retails and stuff like this, the American companies, they cut off the Brazilian companies. They say, I don't need you to do localization. I can do it myself. So they kill it. The companies didn't raise enough money and never developed something for themselves. So this ended up killing, like they say, the PC developers, because they never became developers. They only were doing like localization, which is really interesting because in Taiwan, they had the opposite issue. Around like in 89 in Taiwan, they signed that international treaty for copyright over software. And so the Taiwanese government was like, okay, before I didn't care. It was perfectly legal. There was no law against like pirating software. Now it is illegal. So there was like magazines who were like run by pirate companies. Like it wasn't pirate companies, but let's say unofficial releases.
Yes.
The magazines, they were used to do like, okay, this is the PC port of Dragon Quest. This is like the Ultima translated to Chinese. And like they saw that rule and they're like, okay, now we have to do our own games, but we have the know-how. And so they got those people that they were in contact with. So let's say, oh, you are the guy who did the unofficial port of Dragon Quest 1, let's say, to MS-DOS. Mm-hmm. Can you do a Dragon Quest-like RPG from zero, official release, made for Taiwanese people? They were like, okay, let's do it. And this was the start of like Softstar and a bunch of Taiwanese companies. We never had this in Brazil, they just stayed localized forever and then died. Mm-hmm. So I really like this parallel, this history. You see, like, on one hand, it looks super good that we get the official products, but in the end, this is what killed our industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Italy, you did get translated pirated games. We're talking, of course, like early 90s, late 80s, but they were, calling them translation is really giving them too much compliment. I would say they're basically hacks. So they were just very young people who got into this early games and just hacked what they could, because of course you would have to reprogram the game in a way to make the translation fit, because Italian is often also quite longer than English, and of course no way they would do that. So they would basically, what you would get is like a garbled title screen so that they could fit Italian in there if they wanted to do that. That's the extent of what they did translation wise. And if you get more complicated games, like for example Stormbringer, which is a great Commodore 64 adventure game, they would just leave it in English. They just did not care. They just put the Italian title in the manual. They left the game in English. So of course no one played it. That's what I meant. So it didn't have this kind of games really had little to no influence on the developers that were shaping up. But then again, the scene was so small, the developer scene back then in Italy, that finding games that were actually influential is very difficult, because you have to struggle to find a connection between, what, for example, Simul Mondo was doing in the late 80s versus where the influence from on Simul Mondo comes from. I don't know, not even sure what influence is that. Just probably a crazy person running Simul Mondo. But yeah, it's definitely interesting that translation has so much to do with how the development scene actually it's where it comes from, and where does it go from when the translation actually start being legit and official, which is of course for example in Italy was a big part of why LucasArts games were so influential and still so important, and still one of the the biggest games that everyone remembers, even those that are not even gamers anymore, that never played a game again after 93, but they still remember, Monkey Island, Day of the Tentacle, all of that. So definitely a big part of that was translations, because if no one had bothered to translate, even they were not good translation, even if they were official translation, they were not good, that good, but you still got the market covered, and so that was the key to the success.
For us, they were really good. Like, if you get the Portuguese translation of Green Fandango, to this day, I think it's like one of the best translations. And I was so happy that like when they did the remaster, they put the Portuguese version again, because like it is so good. The voice actor who does Manny, he's like perfect, and he speaks Portuguese but with a Spanish accent, like to get like the kind of like the Mexico vibe. It is so good. Like for me, still like, let's say, top 3 best voice actings I ever seen in a video game, and it's the Portuguese version of Green Fandango.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, the voice acting was also good in Italy, because of course, most stuff in Italy was dubbed. It still is, but back in the day it was a huge market, so the voice actors were still pretty good. But the translation, the adaptation of the text was, that was a little bit hit and miss. Sometimes it was fun, it was quirky. For example, for Sam & Max, they went all in with local dialects. So basically, all characters in Sam & Max all speak like a different regional dialect from Italy, which is, I would say, an acquired taste. It's a bit strange, because in the original game they don't really do that. They don't speak crazy, American accents. I mean, there's a bit of that, but not really everyone. So yeah, in Italy it feels a little bit more cartoonish, but it gives it a little bit of personality, so I don't mind it. I mean, it's a choice. So you might not like it, but at least it's a choice. It's an interesting choice that might have not worked, but it's a choice. As opposed to games that don't really have any, choice. They don't put anything interesting, which what I believe is the problem with the voice acting, even in Italian today. Lost a lot of flavor. It mostly sticks to the original text, so there's not this kind of choices. You'd never see it anymore. Now, no one today would put out regional dialects in a in a game, even if it made sense. But okay, I'm getting off track. Sorry. Uh, so going back to the CRPG, the book. So a big thing that you wanted to do, that you mentioned, is demystifying gaming history, which of course means not just focusing on games that have been talked about over and over, but getting each game its rightful place in history and its rightful coverage. Of course, sometimes that might not be possible for obvious reasons, but that's still, I think, it's an important first step when talking about gaming history. So how was your approach? Did you want to cover every CRPG possible, give every title its space, or how was the approach for the final version of the book, so to speak?
Yeah, that's very tricky because like you can like both of us complain a lot about this on Twitter. I know, like there's a lot of things that really affect how we see history of video games.
Yes.
So like there's kind of like homogenization that like come a lot from the US. Like you were saying, like your experience with Sun and Max has nothing to do with the experience of an American playing Sun and Max, and this is like exactly the same game. Then we go to the things about like different platforms, different games, different kind of releases. Like Americans always get shocked when I tell this, but like the NES for us, the Phantom system that we used the bootleg once, it had the Mega Drive controller. Like I had zero nostalgia for the NES controller, the square one. For me, it always has like the one that looks almost like the Batman boomerang. Like
yes.
That for me is like an NES controller, and even like we're talking about the same console in a way, but it has all these regional differences.
Yep.
So you have this on one hand. On the other hand, you have the thing that like what was popular at the time. Even if you pick, like, let's say, I'm talking only about the United States. A lot of what was popular in the time now is completely dead and forgotten. And some things that were not that popular, they get a cult status because of, like, let's say, a good example is the Ultima games.
Yep.
That like they were extremely important and influential, but I think because they had like such a landmark with Ultima Online and everything, and because Richard Garriott is such like a strong personality, he's still like, at least he was until a while ago, like very active and giving interviews and talking about the legacy of Ultima.
Yep.
I think it grew up to a scale that is not like really representative of what it was back at the time. So, for example, you check in the early 80s, Wizardry was much bigger. Like you check things like, for example, the Computer Gaming World magazine, they used to have a ranking not only of the best-selling games, but also the ones who like let's say the players enjoyed the most. The players would vote, and it was like for 5 years in a row, it was like Wizardry 1 is the top. I actually put that survey at the end of the book because I think it's really like an interesting resource. Because that shows like a completely different perception of how things were. We have this thing that like, okay, Ultima changed everything. But actually until like Ultima 3 was very like not a big series at all. Like it was really Ultima 3 that gave him like the aura of like, okay, Ultima 3 got the gameplay right. Ultima 4 got the story, But it feels like much heavier today. The same thing like if you go to the 90s, people will ask, okay, what are let's say, the most important RPGs of the 90s? People will say something like, okay, Betrayal Krondor, Ultima 7, then probably like Diablo, Fallout, and Baldur's Gate.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like, those were not the best-selling games. Yes, Diablo and Baldur's Gate were, but the best-selling games in the 90s, especially like before Diablo, were the first-person dungeon crawlers, the real-time ones. So Lands of Lore, Eye of the Beholder. Like, you get a game like Stonekeep. Stonekeep was the most expensive RPG of the 90s.
Yep.
And it was like this mega project from Brian Fargo. He spent like 5 years developing the game, spent like a fortune on it. And he sold like a ton of copies that like it sold a lot more than like things that we talk about, like I think it sold like 5 times more than Fallout 1.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a mega hit at the time. But today, like, no one talks about this game anymore. So that kind of thing is very hard for you to bring back when we examine history, you know?
Yeah.
And even like less known games, this is something that I feel like kind of like maybe still fail even after the second release of the game, of the book. Because let's say, if you were gaming in, let's say, the mid 90s, reading the book gives you the impression that, like, okay, you were either playing like Stone Keep or you were playing Diablo, and that's basically it. But you were probably like playing a lot of shareware games as well. And even if they were like very bad games or very simple games, you know, like one that is super famous from the 90s, like Quest of Weep, that is just like kind of like a Windows 95 game that you also for Macintosh. That is just like, you almost look like a very early Flash games, you know, like super basic. You create a character, explore a dungeon, and like go leveling up.
Mm-hmm.
Those games were like important. They were popular, you know, like people were playing those. It's the same thing that I have today, you know, when we're talking about, the big games of the 2020s. And people will not mention Roblox. They will not mention Free Fire. They will not mention those one. Like, there's millions of people playing these games, but they are not part of, you know, like the prestige games, the ones that are like they're important, they have the big legacy
Covered by
and I think you
press.
always have that. So like even if you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, you have the muds, which like you have the big ones, but like everywhere had muds. You had muds in Argentina, you had muds in Brazil, you had muds in Italy. People were playing those.
Yep.
Like, it may not be like as famous, as influential as like Ultima 7, but like they were part of the scene. And it's very hard when you're doing a book in a timeline to get that thing across, you know. Okay, you had the big one. You had people, let's say, playing Ultima 7, but they also were playing mods, they were playing shareware, they were getting like CD-ROMs full of like demos of weird games that maybe never even came out. That was part of the gaming culture that is very hard to get across. I think that was the biggest challenge, that on the first edition of the book, I failed. Like, I think it was very focused on the prestige and the important games. I tried to fix on the second. So I put a lot, especially in the 2000s, I put a lot of Flash games, which like were important, were very popular. Like, you ask about people about Flash RPGs in the 2000s, they're going to talk, I play a lot of like Sony. I play like even the weird ones like Final Fantasy Sonic X and stuff like this, which is like, is weird, but it's cool, and it is part of the history, you know, like we have to mention these games. So that was the process, and it's so difficult. I still don't know if I got it right, but I think that I got it better than the first edition and better than like usually it's done, you know, like it's not a huge step forward, but I think it's a little step forward in the sense of what other books do.
Yeah, and I think the also along with the the local differences, which of course get lost a lot when you're trying to get together a history of what happened. I mean, even RPG, but even worse if you're getting together a history of the gaming industry, of course, which its discourse, as we know, has been user-centric, America-centric for like decades, and maybe now we're starting to see a little bit of changing the discourse, but it's gonna take, of course, another 2 decades before we get to that. I'm trying to do what I can, but okay. But yeah, even worse.
And I'm sure, like, sorry to get, but I'm sure you feel like me, that is very difficult. I feel sometimes almost that I'm brainwashed, and I feel this like right in the book because, like you say, you arrive in the late 90s. You're talking about the history of the late 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Every single book, every single reference will start talking about LAN parties and how people were playing Quake and Doom in LAN parties. And I wrote this in the book. But the thing is, like, we didn't have LAN parties in Brazil because no one had their own, like, IBM PC computer. It was too expensive. We went to LAN houses. And that's, like, is a completely different culture. Like, the idea is similar, everyone together playing a computer, but we were playing in LAN houses, you know, like cyber cafes. The whole idea was like, okay, you play like, the price at the time was like 1 Brazilian real an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And this also became like the name of a documentary about this scene is like R1 the hour. It's a documentary a guy did about this, and like it's a very different culture, like there was a LAN house close to my school where people would say like, okay, after school is over, you can come here and play like the entire afternoon for like R2 or something like this. And there was like a really, how to say, dangerous one that it was like you can play from 10 p.m. until 7 a.m. when school starts. So you can start the entire night just playing games here, like very cheap. And like, this is our culture. But when I, who grew up in this culture, went to write on my book, I was like, okay, people did the LAN parties. No, like they did LAN parties, but they also did the cyber cafes.
You talk about brainwash, and of course, the other thing that I've been noticing is that people from, like, I mean, for Brazil in your case, or Italy in my case, start writing articles about gaming history. They write about things that did not even happen. So it's like I call that the reverse Mandela effect, in that you're getting memories from another country into your own brain. And so they write about things like, I don't know, Sega versus Nintendo in the advertisements. We're going up against each other in commercials on television. And I'm like, that did not happen. That was illegal in Europe at the time. You couldn't do that. You couldn't compare yourself to another company. That was illegal. No one did that. Even now that it's legal, it's still... no one does that because, there's legal ramification. No one wants to get sued. So it's very little of that.
We had a fight about this on Twitter a while ago because a guy was like, oh, because I miss the 90s when people would like get their Game Boy and take them to school to trade Pokemon and everything. And it was like, no one had a Game Boy in Brazil. It was like, what are you talking about? Like I'm 36. I was exactly like, let's say I was 12 years old when Pokemon came out. Like, was like in a middle class school. No one had a Game Boy. We would go to LAN house, like I was saying, and we would play on the Game Boy emulator. That's like for me, the biggest like landmark in Pokemon development was when one of the Game Boy emulators allowed you to trade Pokemons. Because before you couldn't.
I remember,
so they found a way to emulate between two emulators to make the link, so you could trade Pokemons and make them evolve or battle friends. And this, for us who were like playing on the computer, was like revolutionary, because you couldn't get like a Haunter, you couldn't get a Gengar because you had no way to trade on the emulator. So, and then the guy is like, oh, we used to take, the link cable to connect Game Boys. And like, I never saw a link cable in my entire life. The first time in my life that I saw an original PlayStation 1 CD was when I came to Japan in 2012, the first time.
Wow.
I had never seen an original, like with a little box. Never. So like you said, people start to faking these memories, and you're just like, where are you taking this from?
Yes, or for example, going back to Monkey Island, I recently read an article in Italian which said, oh, Monkey Island was released, September of 1990, or more or less, what was it? And I'm like, that was not the Italian release date. It didn't come out in Italy in September, it came out way later, because that's also something that people don't remember at all, the fact that the worldwide release date is a very recent thing. Back in the day, you would get computer games, okay, there was not much of a huge gap. Sometimes there was, but depending on what happened. But yeah, for example, we talk about Sam & Max. The Sam & Max Italian version came out, the voice version came out almost 2 years after its original release date. So one could say, oh, I played Sam & Max in Italian in 1993. No, you didn't, because it didn't come out back then. It came out in 95. And in console games... go ahead, sir.
No, yeah, because of this is what, like, we used to go to... I don't know the word like this in English. I don't even know if this is in English. We had the locadoras, which was the idea, like kind of like a LAN house, but for consoles. Oh. So you go there and there's like, let's say 10 PlayStation 1s on the walls, and you can rent the games to play, or you can buy them for like super cheap because they're all pirate.
Yeah, okay.
I used to go there to play like Japanese games, because the pirate Japanese games were alive much faster than the English ones. So the first time I played Dynasty Warriors, I didn't play Dynasty Warriors. I played Shinsangoku Muzo, and everything was in Japanese. And I was just like, okay, this is super fun. I have no idea what is going on. but this is super fun. And it was part of the culture. Like you had gaming magazines in Brazil that would release like the Japanese translation of games. So let's say Parasite Eve came out. It would come out, let's say, in Japan. We will get the pirate CD and start playing it. And like, if you don't know English and you don't know Japanese, you don't know either of them. So like, so you get like the little magazine that say, okay, this is the save menu, this is the load menu, this is what each of the guns do, this is what each of the powers do, and has like a little walkthrough. So I remember playing Parasite Eve with my friends, and we just like reading the magazine and try to understand the Japanese inputs and stuff like this. Like, so yeah, we were playing those games way before the English release. We're playing the same time as the Japanese release in that case, the pirate version. Like you said, is this kind of nuance that is completely lost when you see someone who, especially if they weren't there, or if they think like we were talking brainwash, like you get too used to taking everything. Let's say you go to Moby Games and you see, okay, the release date is this day. This means that across the entire planet, everyone was playing the next day. No, it wasn't.
No, not at all. And you see that a lot in so-called the twists and turns of gaming history. We could say, for example, one example I always say is Ninja Gaiden, and Ninja Gaiden NES in America was big, was a huge game that everyone mostly remembers playing it and losing again and again, obviously. And so one that writes, for example, an history of the most influential NES games would probably put Ninja Gaiden somewhere in there. But the fact is, in Europe, Ninja Gaiden was almost nothing. It did almost nothing because it came out, I think it was mid 1993, so almost 3 years after its original Japanese release date. It was also called Shadow Warriors, so it even had a different title because, again, ninja back then, they were still had, this whole thing about, oh no, we can use the word ninja because they're dangerous and everything. So the UK was still driving the market in that regard for some reason, but yeah. And but I don't remember anyone even mentioning Shadow Warriors. I mean, I don't know one that had it. I mean, 1993, Super Nintendo was already out, and I mean, I think Ninja Gaiden looked already primitive. In 1993, it didn't really look, oh wow, Ninja Gaiden. So I mean, of course, I don't have any hard data, but I can definitely say that it wasn't as influential as it was in the US. So that kind of Ninja Gaiden are the top most influential NES games for someone from Europe. So not even from Italy or from Spain or whatever, but yeah, from Europe would not even mean that much. I mean, that's also a case of brainwash, because one that comes out from that list will say, oh, of course, Ninja Gaiden. I mean, obviously, I don't know, it was big, a huge game. It's still a series that's still, kind of alive today and everything. But that's not the whole truth. So you got to remember what happened.
Yeah, we were talking about this the other day. That like, it was a random tweet that I saw that was like someone made a really cute animation of how's it called, Delicious in Dungeon, that anime that's coming out now, Dungeon Meshi, where they did like the 4 characters in the style of Sorcerian, which is one of like a super famous PC RPG, like also console, but like mainly like a PC RPG in Japan, that doesn't have like barely, like it came out, Sierra released it in America, but it was completely like destroyed by reviewers and everything. And the thing is, like, in Japan is a very nostalgic game, like from the people who grew up in that era. But if you ask, let's say, people outside of Japan about which Japanese RPGs are important, they will never mention it. No. They will talk about Dragon Quest, they'll talk about how's it called, oh my god, Final Fantasy.
Yep.
And those, like, from the 80s, that will be the big ones.
Yeah, they don't mention like Hydlide or
yeah, they won't mention like even like stuff like Tower of Druaga, which is like fundamental to the evolution of Japanese games. Absolutely. As a whole. But it's not that, and it's really weird because even, let's say, the own Japanese history, because we don't have that much things, or let's say like Japanese writers publishing in English, their history gets told in English by Americans.
Yeah.
And it creates like these really weird things. Like I have one book in Japanese here about the history of the Japanese game industry. And it's super interesting because he mentioned things that like you never hear about in other media. Like, for example, he talks about how Puzzles and Dragons was the game that completely redefined the Japanese game industry in the 2000s. And like, who talks about Puzzles and Dragons in the West? Like, it's
Oh,
you
wow.
know, it is the game that was like, okay, you can move to mobile, you can do gacha. It like was the savior of some companies when they were like, okay, we cannot do PlayStation 3 graphics. We don't have the budget for that. What do we do? Then they went to gacha. They went to like simpler games on mobile. It was like a paradigm shift for the entire industry. And is, if you want to say any foreigner to write a history, like say the most important games in Japanese history, they will never put their game. So because it's a mobile game, it's a gacha. This is trash, you know.
Yes.
And it's a very tricky thing when dealing with history. This kind of not only prejudices but also trying to get more information from the source.
I mean, that of course we can understand that. Oftentimes it's difficult to get information from Japan about certain games. I mean, that's not much that one Western writer can do about that. That we can forgive. But the thing is that again, I think most Western writers are just writing on the basis of past articles done by other Western writers. So of course, they got their Final Fantasy, their Dragon Quest, like mandatory on the list, and most other stuff is probably not necessary if we want to talk about the origin of the Japanese RPG. And for example, one of the things that gets forgotten a lot is the fact that most original developers of Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, for example, since we're talking about those, came from adventure games. And how important was a Western game like Mystery House in Japan for the development of the adventure game scene. So in a way, you could even you could even say that it was Mystery House that influenced Final Fantasy rather than most other things that you read in this kind of article. You would be kind of right. I mean, of course, it's not 100%, but that's where they came from. They came from the adventure game scene that was huge in Japan back then. But that's not something that you barely read about. I mean, it gets mentioned sometimes in a couple of videos, of course, but it's really obscure stuff, which shouldn't be, because again, we're talking about Final Fantasy Dragon Quest, so it's very famous games. Yuji Horii came from that very same thing, but no one really mentions it because again, you have to do your research, and that takes time. That's also
and also is what we were talking about. Some games, if they don't have a voice, either let's say the original developers around talking about the game or the current IP holders. For me, that was super visible with King's Quest, because we had that remake like a few years ago, like that. And when that remake came out, they did a huge media push to like bring King's Quest back into memory. Yeah. So you had like every single website writing about this legacy. You had like they brought Roberta Williams back to the Game Awards and stuff like this. But the thing is, like, before that, not only people didn't know about King Quest, they wouldn't talk about it. Like, I remember, like, I don't like to shame people, but there's that book, like the 1001 most important video games, games that you must play before dying.
Yeah.
The guy managed to list 1001 games and not put a single King's Quest game there. And I'm like, how do you even do this? Those games were like, they were like, they were the competitors with LucasArts and everything. They were like leading games. Like King's Quest 4 is like the game that like helps bring music into computers and everything. Like it's a huge legacy. But the thing is, like, Sierra is dead. EA didn't care much about it, and Roberta Williams was on a boat sailing across the world. So like he didn't have no one to keep the legacy alive, I feel this is starting to happen with like series like Ultima, Might and Magic. Like no one talks about Might and Magic anymore because you had the Might and Magic 10, and we used to have the Heroes of Might and Magic, but now like
it's gone.
There is nothing. So I think it's a process that just keeps happening, if you don't have an active voice, which is like is what Nintendo does so well. Even if, like, let's say, if they don't release a new, I don't know, a new, what's the name of the game with the little angel?
Kid Icarus.
Yeah, even if they don't release Kid Icarus, the guy is in Super Smash Bros.
Yep.
So there's like 1 billion YouTube videos about his lore, his games, and everything. So that helps keep things fresh, Like other companies don't have this, so the games just vanish.
Yeah, it's fascinating actually that Nintendo is on one hand is so bad at keeping its history intact because they won't release past games on modern consoles or modern platforms. They hide a lot of all the interviews and design documents behind huge walls, and they're very difficult to access and to view, even though they're super interesting. Blah blah blah. But on the other hand, they're very good at keeping everything from their past very much there. Like, maybe it's not in the foreground like Kid Icarus, but still very much in the background. So you got Nintendo fans that still talk about all of it, and those even the smaller characters who never had another game again. But yeah, they're very good at balancing those two things out. I would like to see more of their history displayed, and actually that we can access as researchers and people interested. But okay, it's Nintendo, so I don't not holding my breath on that. But yeah, talking about twists and turns of history, and of course I have to mention this. We're talking about obscure RPG, so that's coming up. The famous Rings of Power. So Rings of Power, 19. Felipe knows that it was gonna happen. He was waiting for it. Yeah, he's gonna mention Rings of Power. Okay, so I'm known on Twitter as the Rings of Power Stan boy, old man, and but yeah, regardless of my personal history with Rings of Power, it is an incredibly fascinating game because it comes from Naughty Dog, and
Yeah.
the fact that Naughty Dog is still alive today, and obviously Naughty Dog of today has nothing to do with the Naughty Dog of 1991, or even with the Naughty Dog of Crash Bandicoot, if that is of any help. But yeah, we're talking about twists and turns, and it is so interesting because Rings of Power was a huge turning point for Naughty Dog, and I can safely say that if Rings of Power had not happened, and if it had not crashed and burned like it did, mostly because there were several reasons why it was not successful. The first fact why it was on the wrong platform, obviously, but that's Naughty Dog's fault. Apparently they were very keen on, we want to do a Mega Drive game, so it's their fault. We can blame Electronic Arts on that, but we can blame Electronic Arts for the fact that they never did another print of Rings of Power, so they just stopped at the first print. When they ran out of cards, they said, no, that's too expensive because it has the extra RAM, the save RAM. Madden is more cheap to produce, so we're gonna do another print of Madden. Rings of Power is just gonna stop. We're not gonna produce it anymore. So it didn't have even any chance to become a cult hit because there weren't enough cards to become a cult hit. So, okay, so that's Electronic Arts' fault. But it was so traumatic for Naughty Dog at the time, the fact that they put their hearts and soul into Rings of Power, that it was gonna be their huge hit. It was their games of passion, because that's what they wanted to do. That's what Andy and Gavin and Jason wanted to do, but it didn't turn out that well at all. So they broke off with Electronic Arts after that, and of course they did the terrible Way of the Warrior, which again almost killed them. That literally almost killed them. But and then they got the offer and went off and did Crash Bandicoot. But if Rings of Power had been successful, so if it actually been produced on PC, for example, it might have found its audience, might have been successful. Naughty Dog might have continued making RPGs. I'm pretty sure. That's what they want to do. We saw that with Keith the Thief before that. They were very adamant that they wanted to do RPGs. So we might have seen Naughty Dog doing something completely different. So we might have not Crash Bandicoot, no Uncharted, not The Last of Us. So so in a way we could say, again, twists and turns of history. And no one remembers Rings of Power except for the Amazon series, which has of course nothing to do with it. But that game was responsible for so many big AAA games today that it's almost embarrassing to talk about the fact that, it's responsible for all the stuff. So those are, I think, interesting twists and turns of history that if you don't do your research, in this case you can do your research because, Naughty Dog history it can be searched. There's a lot of interviews. So if you don't know about Rings of Power when you talk about Naughty Dog, it's your fault. I'm sorry. But yeah, that's what you find out if you do your research. If you're able to go outside.
But
of
that is very difficult, even if you go, like, let's say, for example, Ubisoft. Ubisoft people will go like, okay, the huge mega company, In the past, they did Rayman. How many people know that in the 80s they were doing PC RPGs that were like huge in France and like some of them like only released in French? That they had like their own like really bold visionary developers making like very outlaw games, and they were doing like a bunch of like not really illegal but very like complicated things like tracing the cover of movie tracing movie posters to make the cover art of their games and stuff like this. So you had that thing going on, but like even when you go into YouTube channels making the history of Ubisoft, they would usually skip that. They're like, oh, this is not important, when like actually like those things had a huge impact. They would talk like, I remember when Zombie U came out for the Wii, they went all the way, oh, this is because Ubisoft's first game was Zombie and blah, blah, blah. But like between Zombie and like, let's say, Rayman, you had a huge scene that was like super important, created like a bunch of like influential titles.
Yep.
And it's just like not something that you see talked about, not even like by researchers, by YouTubers, or especially by Ubisoft itself, which I think like is super weird. They never talk about anything like, even Rayman and stuff like this is very rare. All the developers, in a sense, do this. Like, you don't see like EA talking about like, oh, this is when we did like the pinball creating game or something like this. Like, they don't go back in a sense. Like, I think really like Nintendo is probably the company that goes back the most, and we have all the complaints about like everything, but it's really either that of like Atari trying to sell super not Atari, let's say the ghost of Atari being reanimated as a zombie for like the Atari zombie for like the 20th time. But like other companies don't do this. Like you will never hear something about their past.
Yeah. So Sega started doing it a bit, mostly I think following Nintendo footsteps, and also because it has seen that the hardcore like Sega fan base is there, so there's a market, but it's not really in their blood, so to speak. I mean, they're trying to do it, but it feels a little bit forced. I don't know. I mean, at least to me. But I mean, good that they're doing it. But yeah, they definitely should, because they also have a huge history of very old computers that no one remembers. I mean, they weren't hugely successful, obviously, but you got a lot of games that are now completely forgotten on the SE 1000, the SE 3000. No one remembers those.
Yeah, even the Master System, like it feels like their history starts on the Mega Drive,
Yes. I mean, the Master System, again, I always try to say this, but it was, of course, it was huge in Brazil, we know that, but it was also
we had the Street Fighter for Master System.
Exactly. It was also huge, but it was also huge in Europe. I mean, there's a couple of exceptions, like, for example, Sweden, that they didn't really cater to the Master System, they went just for the NES, but for the most part, Master System was definitely big in Europe, even in the United Kingdom, for example, talking about a big market, the Master System was, until 1990, I think, was from the data that I've found, it was the best-selling console at the time, 8-bit best-selling console. But you don't really see a lot of passion for it anymore, especially for a while, so it's been definitely going on for a while. I mean, there's a huge thing about Mega Drive, and even the Saturn is making a comeback for some reason. And the
Dreamcast, people have a lot of nostalgia for.
Yeah, the Dreamcast is like, the best console never could. And I'm not saying it of course that they're wrong, but it's interesting that the Master System again was so influential, so popular in Europe, and it's now no one would buy a Master System Mini, for example. I think they would have a really small market footprint, and Sega would never be interested in doing that. Let alone a CS 3000 Mini, that would like be 10 maybe units would sell, if that. But yeah. But yes, you were saying about Ubisoft, and it is interesting because I've done a few streams on Twitch of old French games, and I've tried to go back and look at what was going on in France in the 80s. Of course, I had no guide, so it was a little bit like stumbling in the dark. So like I've asked on Twitter, but I've tried to do try to look at games and see how does it play, is this interesting? But mostly it was just, let's play all the French games that I can find from the 80s and early 90s. So of course I started from Zombie, because that was the one that I played on the Commodore 64. And the Commodore 64 version was not that good. Now that I've seen the Amiga version, the Amstrad also CPC version, definitely better. The Commodore 64 was a bit strange, but also it was in black and white for some reason. But okay, it did add to the atmosphere. But okay, sorry. But yes, the French scene in the 80s and early 90s, it's so unique. It's so interesting.
It's so cool, yeah.
That really you could make like 10 videos about it, and you still have things to talk about and that to show the people. Because they really add their own style. I mean, of course, it's called the French touch now, but now I don't know who uses that word, but yeah, it's mostly called the French touch. But it was really so unique. Of course, I mean, most people would remember, the classics from Delphin Software, and that mostly that this ones people remember, like Christopher Corps and Future Wars, maybe. Yeah, and also most of the time, the interesting thing is that these were not very good games, at least gameplay wise. And some of them are even now impossible to play because they depend so much on what was included in the box that they're almost impossible to play, because the box included all clues and addresses that you had to go to. And of course, you can follow a walkthrough today, but it's not really the same thing, obviously. So out of the box, you just run this game without a walkthrough, without a manual. They're impossible to play. You just have no idea what to do, and it's a very unique experience that nowadays is mostly lost. The playing this game out of the box experience without knowing anything about it. And I mean, obviously now the culture has changed, so most games would have a tutorial or something to introduce yourself. We lost the manual, so obviously we need to teach the player what to do, unless they might feel lost and switch off. But that's the thing. They might feel lost and switch off. I mean, back then, as you mentioned, also the main thing was about we felt lost a lot of the time, and and you maybe today we could call that grinding. I don't know, but it was really about learning the mechanics of, especially if it was an RPG, because of course they were more complicated than most other games, or strategy games even worse. But yeah. But it was really a feeling of also teaching the player, to learn the mechanics by themselves, which is kind of a unique thing that nowadays, when you're mostly, just learning things according to what the developers are telling you or what they want. But back then, you were really more free to experiment, to learn, and to have no kind of prejudice over your head, which gives kind of a different mentality. I don't know if you're following my rant.
I think a lot of it. Yeah, I think some of those, like, I really like itch.io games because some of them still have that kind of vibe of like,
Yes.
especially of the French scene of like weird stuff. Is why like one of my favorite games of last year was Basilisk 2000, because for me that felt like almost like a mix of like a puzzle game and those like how's it called, enhanced reality games, the AR games and stuff like this. But also what you're talking about exploring, I have nostalgia for that, but I also think a huge part of that is that basically, like, especially if you were younger, depending on when you were, like, you had like one game every year or every 6 months, and not only you had enough time to, let's say, hit your head into the wall until the wall breaks and you understand the game, but also like that's it. Like you have that game. Like here's like Ultima 4. It's going to take you like 3 months to understand everything that is going on, to do all the discovery, but like you have nothing else to play. So I think it's something that we're not going to get like again in this sense, because now you have Steam, and like let's say the price of one game in D8 is now you can buy like 30 games that are like fantastic games that are on discount and everything. So like, and if you get tired of it, if it's getting difficult or frustrating, you can just jump to another game. So it's really hard sometimes to see like this kind of mechanic going by. I think it's one of those, this and that sense of wonder that we had in the past that is so difficult to capture. The other day I saw that like Digimon World from the PlayStation 1 just completed, I think was 25 years or 20. I think it's 24. Yeah, 25 years. Yeah, 1999. Yeah. And that game for me is very like my childhood, I remember a lot of that game because it was that wonder of, when video games were still new and seeing what they could do were like amazing. So I was in school at the time, and I remember we would skip school, like skip class, jump the wall, and then go to my friend's house. He lived like super close to the school. We will go there for him to show us the Digimons that he had evolved. And he was like, look, I have like the Metal Greymon. And we were like, okay, I am seeing a 3D model, an animated 3D model of that monster on TV. And just seeing the 3D model moving around and everything was already like mind blowing, Like we will do the same thing for like Mortal Kombat. Like in this game, you can do fatalities. And we will get the magazine with fatalities and go to his house. And everyone, he's going to do the Liu Kang fatality where the dragon eats the guy. And he will do, and we were like, it's like, this is that kind of like fascination of, I talked before, like no one had computers like in Brazil, like in the early 90s. So when people would go to my house and see, you have a computer and like your father is playing Betrayal of Crondor, when it has these people dressed in like costumes, these FMV sequences with voice, like which you didn't have on consoles, you had actual voice.
Mm-hmm.
People will see that and be like, oh my God, this is like mind blowing. Like the computer is making music. Like that kind of thing was so important for some of the early games. Like the whole multimedia CD-ROM thing was about this, Here's a CD you put on your computer, and if you have the sound card, if you have the speakers and everything, you have like you're playing TIE Fighter and you have Luke Skywalker talking to you or something like this, and you're like, okay, yeah, this is amazing. People will just watch that and be like, amazing. you will never have this again because like people now, they grew up with cell phones, like they are seeing these things much more advanced since they were born. So that kind of thing is, in a sense, I think is just part of, like, for sure we who grew up with this are nostalgic about this, but I think it's just natural that it passes and there's no way to bring this back, and like we cannot force this back. And I think it's kind of foolish to try to force it back, but you have to know this to understand that why some games were the way they were. Like if you don't understand this marvel at technology, you don't understand FMV's games,
Yeah, which I think is part of the the discourse that technology is, the evolution of technology is kind of slowing down, and it's what I always say. I mean, I remember like I don't know if in Brazil you had like the emulation scene on computers. Probably not, but in Italy, there was a small community of people that were playing emulators, so Super Nintendo emulators, Mega Drive emulators back in late 90s, 97, 98.
Everyone that I knew, like on the LAN house, we had the ZSNES.
Perfect.
Super nostalgic
so
for
you know
that,
what I'm talking. Genesis and K-Gen, all those old emulators.
Yeah, the VGBA for the Game Boy, I think.
Yes, exactly. And for example, I remember that Chrono Trigger was not an old game at all by that point. It was 2 years old, maybe something like that. But the thing is that when it came out in Italy, it was so expensive, and it came out also kind of a late stage. PlayStation was coming in also in the country, and PlayStation had a big boom in Italy, very early on, and of course piracy helped that. But yeah, that's another discussion. And but most people wanted to play it, but a lot of people did not play it, interestingly. So Chrono Trigger was big in Italy, but not because it came out on the Super Nintendo and everyone bought it. It was big because at one point I remember the big news that finally I don't know if it was the SNES or the SNES 9X, which emulator was it, that finally made Chrono Trigger playable. And I remember the scene was in shambles. Everyone was rushing in and saying, finally we can play Chrono Trigger. And it was really like, I mean, that's not even an old game, it's just 3 years ago. So why didn't you play on your Super Nintendo? Because it was expensive and no one, very few people bought it. So that's another interesting twist and turn that you could say about a very famous game that everyone now knows by heart, but in for many people that I know, the first time that they played it was actually on an emulator, Super Nintendo
For
emulator.
us, that was Pokemon, and it's actually something funny that like I never played a Pokemon game at 100% speed. Like, because on the emulators you like press space and go like 3 times, and like
Of course.
it plays so much better. The first time, like I think I was like when Pokemon X came out, like a few years ago, that like a friend of mine bought actually the was like the 3DS and Pokemon X.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, I want to actually, first time in my life I'm holding like an official Nintendo portable with the official cartridge. Let me play. And I was like, this is so slow. You cannot speed up. Like this is very weird for me that I have to play Pokemon. Like everything is so slow. So you know, like I grew up playing Pokemon my entire life, but like 2-3% speed, like the 200 300 speed.
It's Pokemon 3X, the famous version.
Yeah, exactly.
No one played except you and a few other Brazilian people.
Yeah, there's the X, the Y, and the percentage, 300%.
Exactly. Okay, I mean, I would love to talk a lot more, but I mean, Felipe has got off work just a few hours ago, so he's tired. So I think we can definitely end this discussion here. But yeah, thank you very much, Felipe, for staying with us. Of course, we will stick the load link for the CRPG book, which also has a physical edition by Bitmap Books, right?
Yeah, it has. I have it here. Let me
Oh,
have this huge book.
wow!
But yeah,
Yes.
huge. The PDF is free for everyone. You can download. Like, it's a non-profit project. The hardcover version, we are selling it, but all the profits from it goes to an NGO in Brazil. So it's like
Charity.
it continues being a non-profit project.
That's yes, that's very good. So yeah, we will recommend everyone listening, of course, to go download this RPG book. If you hadn't do that yet, shame on you, but you can still atone for your sins. But yeah, thank you, Felipe, for staying with us, and we hope to have you back soon so we can talk some more obscure RPGs. And thank you.
Sure, thank you.